Catherine Walsh thought she knew what faith looked like after 4 decades of prayer and Sunday school teaching and women's Bible studies and a marriage built on shared belief and daily devotion. But then her husband died and everything she thought she knew about God vanished, not her belief. She still believed, but the feeling of faith, the warmth and certainty and sense of God's presence disappeared like breath from a mirror. What do you do when you still believe in God but can't feel Him anymore? When church feels too loud and prayer feels like shouting into void, and every morning you wake up wondering if you'll survive another day? When the silence after loss isn't just loneliness but the absence of anyone who truly witnesses your life? When grief doesn't feel like sadness but like drowning in water that never recedes? This is Catherine's story, but it might also be yours. A story about what happens when faith stops being performance and starts being presence. When you stop trying to survive God and learn to sit with Him instead. When your soul stops grinding against impossible circumstances and starts flowing with a love that's been carrying you all along. At 4:52 a.m., Catherine woke to an empty bed and a crushing question: what if this is the rest of my life? 20 more years of this darkness. 20 more years of feeling abandoned by the God I still believe in, but she didn't know yet that in that very moment of drowning, in that hour of deepest despair, something was beginning to shift. She didn't know that morning light had been breaking outside her window all along while she sat, with eyes closed, in her kitchen. Didn't know that presence could exist alongside absence, that companionship could transform loneliness without removing it, that healing wasn't about going back to who she was before but learning to flow forward into who she was becoming. This is a story about gentle renewal, about discovering that God's faithfulness looks different than we expect, about finding that the same love which brings sunrise every morning will keep bringing you back to life, one breath at a time, one dawn at a time, one moment of surrender at a time, until the day you realize you're not just surviving anymore, you're learning to flow. The casserole dishes had been returned. The sympathy cards lined the mantel like soldiers standing guard over silence. And Kate Walsh sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, staring at 2 coffee mugs she'd pulled from the cabinet out of habitude for her. One for a man who would never drink coffee again. She put one back, her hand trembling slightly as she returned it to the shelf, and settled into the chair that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too permanent in its solitude. The house didn't feel empty in the way she'd expected. It felt erased, like someone had taken a fine brush and carefully removed every sound that used to fill the space between walls. No throat clearing from the living room, no footsteps on the stairs at 6 a.m., no voice calling from the garage asking if she'd seen his reading glasses. Kate had been a person of faith for 40 years, had taught Sunday school and prayed over sick children and struggling marriages and her own daughter's wedding, and she believed God. She still believed, but belief and presence were proving to be 2 entirely different things. She whispered to the empty kitchen, "I know you're here," but only the refrigerator hummed back. And she realized with a sinking clarity that nobody had warned her grief wouldn't feel like sadness, but like absence. Not just the absence of James, though she felt that too with every breath, but the absence of herself, like the woman who used to inhabit this body had walked out the door with her husband's casket, and what remained was just someone going through motions, breathing and eating when she remembered, and answering texts from her children with, "I'm fine, honey, don't worry." The morning light hit the kitchen window at an angle that used to make James squint, and he'd always sat with his back to it, reading the news on his tablet while she did the crossword in actual ink. 36 years of that rhythm, 36 years of predictable, ordinary, blessed rhythm that was now just memory. She picked up her Bible from the counter, the same one she'd carried to church for 2 decades, with margins full of notes and underlines and dates of prayers answered, and opened it randomly to Psalm 42. "My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me all day long, 'Where is your God?'" She closed it quickly, not ready for that particular honesty, not ready to admit that she was asking the same question, and sat there in the sunlight that now just hurt, wondering how many more mornings like this she could possibly survive. The hardest part wasn't the crying or the empty bed or even the way her children's voices sounded. Careful and concerned on the phone, it was the moments when Kate forgot, when she'd be loading the dishwasher thinking, "I should tell James about what Sarah said," or seeing a cardinal at the bird feed her, and reaching for her phone to text him a photo, only to have the remembering crash through her like a trapdoor opening under her chest. Every single time the forgetting happened, the remembering felt new and devastating, a fresh wound that never quite scabbed over before it was torn open again. But that wasn't even the silence people talked about at grief support groups, or the loneliness the widows at church warned her about with sad, knowing eyes. This was something deeper and more terrifying. The silence of having no witness to her own life. No one on earth who knew that she talked to herself while grading papers or ate broken cookies first, because perfect ones deserved to be saved, or prayed differently when she was angry, shorter, blunter, almost confrontational. James had known her. Not the Sunday morning version, or the teacher at parent conferences, or the mom at family dinners, but the actual woman who stress cleaned at midnight and cried during insurance commercials and sometimes God for making everything so complicated. Now, that accountability of being known had vanished, and she stood in front of the bathroom mirror one morning with her toothbrush in hand, realizing she could stop brushing her teeth and nobody would know, could wear the same sweater for 5 days, or eat cereal for every meal, or skip meals entirely. And without that witness, she felt optional, like a character someone had written out of the story. When her daughter Emma called from Portland asking, "How are you, Mom?" "Really?" and pressing about eating and sleeping, Kate gave the expected answers. "I'm okay, sweetheart, of course." Enough, while hearing her grandson babbling in the background. Sweet and oblivious. Life continuing as it should. But what Emma didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that Kate didn't just need people who cared about her. She needed someone who knew her without asking. Someone who could read her silences and interpret her moods and understand the thousands of unspoken things that made up the texture of daily existence. The weight of that loss settled on her shoulders like a physical thing as she ended the call and sat in the quiet house, understanding for the first time that loneliness wasn't about being alone, but about being unseen. And she wondered if anyone would ever truly see her again, or if she would spend the rest of her life translating herself to people who could never quite understand the language she was speaking. It happened on a Wednesday when Kate was sitting in the third pew at Crossway Community, her pew, the one she'd occupied for 17 years, and pastor Mike started talking about the faithfulness of God in seasons of trial, and something in her chest just broke open with a clarity so sharp it might as well have been audible. The thought came unbidden and undeniable. "I don't feel you." Not the gentle questioning of someone exploring doubt, but the raw confession of someone who had run out of spiritual pretense. "I believe you exist. I believe you're sovereign. I believe every single doctrine I've ever affirmed, but I don't feel you. I don't sense you. I don't experience you, and you feel absent." Around her, the worship team started the closing song. Something upbeat about joy and victory and dancing in the morning, and hands lifted and voices rose, and a woman to Rosa head swayed with her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face, in what looked like genuine encounter with the divine. Kate sat perfectly still, feeling like a fraud, not because she'd stopped believing, but because belief without feeling seemed like a counterfeit faith. Like showing up to a marriage with a contract, but no love technically valid, but spiritually bankrupt. She'd spent 40 years as a Christian and knew what intimacy with God was supposed to feel like. The warmth and peace and sense of His presence, so real it was almost tangible. But where was that now when she needed it most? She drove home in silence, bypassing the Christian radio station she usually kept on, and at a red light gripped the steering wheel and said it out loud. "I still believe in you, but I don't feel you." No lightning strike came, no gentle whisper, no sudden warmth flooding her chest. Just the red light turning green and her continuing home to the empty house that waited like a tomb. That night, Kate did something she hadn't done since high school, opened a blank journal and wrote without filter. Without the careful theological framing she usually applied to her prayers. "Dear God, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to have faith that feels like an empty room. I thought losing James would make me run to you, but instead I feel like I'm standing outside your house, knocking, and nobody's answering. I'm not angry. I'm just numb, and I don't know if that's worse." She stared at the words for a long time, feeling both terrified and relieved to have finally admitted the truth. Then added one more line that felt like both surrender and defiance. "If you're there, I need you to show up differently than you ever have before, because what used to work doesn't work anymore." She closed the journal. And for the first time in 6 weeks, exhausted by the honesty she'd finally allowed herself, she slept through the night. Catherine Marie Walsh, Kate, to everyone who knew her. Mrs. Walsh to 23 years worth of second graders who still sent her Christmas cards with crooked handwriting and glitter glue. Had been born in New Hampshire, raised Presbyterian, and married at 26 to a man she met at a church picnic named James Walsh. Accountant and Stephen Ministries volunteer and builder of birdhouses and terrible teller of dad jokes. They'd wanted 4 children, but got 2, Emma in 1987 and David in 1990, and lived what she'd always considered a normal life, a blessed life, full of ordinary miracles like morning coffee rituals and family game nights, and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. She taught elementary school because she loved the age when kids still thought teachers knew everything. Led women's Bible study on Thursday mornings because it felt like breathing, just a natural rhythm of gathering and sharing and praying. Served with James in the church nursery once a month, even after their own kids were grown, because babies smelled like hope. 36 years of marriage had given her a clear sense of identity. James's wife, Emma, and David's mom, Mrs. Walsh, the teacher with the classroom library and the sticker rewards. Kate, the woman who brought lemon bars to potlucks and always signed up for early service setup. But now, all those defining relationships had either ended or shifted, and she was left with just Kate, widow 62 years old, retired, alone, trying to figure out who she was when stripped of all the roles that used to give her life shape and meaning. She'd read once that people in long marriages start to share a nervous system, that you sync up in sleep cycles and immune responses and even heartbeats. Measurable scientific phenomena. And she wondered what happened when half of that system stopped it, the other half keep beating, or did it just learn to limp? Standing in her bedroom on a Friday afternoon, staring at James's side of the closet where his shirts still hung in color-coded ordered blues, grays, the 3 button-downs she'd bought him for Christmas that he never got to wear. Kate understood that her children's offers to help pack up his things or donate them to the church clothing drive came from love, but she wasn't ready. Not because she thought James was coming back or because she didn't understand the permanence of death, but because she didn't know who she was without the option of him. Without the daily reference point of we that had structured every sentence and decision for more than 3 decades. For 36 years she'd spoken in plural. We're going to the store, we're thinking about repainting, we're praying about it to end. Now every sentence had to be relearned in singular. And prayer especially felt impossible because it had always been a conversation she had with someone, either with James or with God, or sometimes both at once. The 3 of them tangled up in a communion that felt as natural as breathing. That was her entire resume now. Kate, 62, retired teacher, widow, woman of faith who couldn't feel her faith anymore, and she had absolutely no idea what came next. At 4:52 a.m., Kate opened her eyes in the dark and knew instantly that sleep was over. Not because of a noise or a dream, but because grief had learned her rhythms and knew exactly when to strike in that thin hour before dawn, when the body is awake but the defenses are still asleep, when there's nothing to distract from the stark reality of loss. She turned her head to see James's side of the bed smooth and untouched, a permanent accusation of absence, and noticed the clock on his nightstand, still blinking, 12 o'clock. Because neither of them had ever bothered to reset it after the power outage in March, since he used his phone alarm anyway. Past tense. Everything was past tense now. The house was so quiet she could hear the settling of beams, the hum of the water heater in the basement, the tick of the kitchen clock 2 rooms away, and underneath it all, the constant pressure of grief that people always said came in waves but didn't. Because waves receded and gave you a moment to breathe between crashes, whereas this was more like water in her lungs. Constant and suffocating, every breath requiring conscious effort. Sitting up and pulling her knees to her chest, Kate pressed her palms against her eyes and thought, not prayed, just stated a fat God, I can't do this. She'd been strong at the funeral, strong through the condolence visits and the paperwork and the bank accounts and the phone calls to insurance companies, had held her children while they cried and assured everyone she'd be fine. But at 4:52 in the morning, alone in a bed that used to hold 2, she wasn't strong. She was drowning. The thought came suddenly and with terrifying clarity. What if this is it? What if this is the rest of my life? 62 years old with, statistically, maybe 20 more years ahead. Maybe 25 if she was lucky, a full third of her life still to live. And all of it like this. All of it waking up at 4:52 a.m. to an empty bed and a silence so thick it had texture. She stood on shaky legs and made it to the window, drawing back the curtain to see the neighborhood still dark with streetlights. Glowing orange and someone's porch light left on, and in the distance the faint gray line of the ocean against the sky, not dawn, yet becoming. Standing there for a long time, watching the darkness hold its ground against the inevitable light. Something shifted in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but permission. Permission to be this broken. Permission to not have answers. Permission to stand at a window at 4:52 in the morning and simply be without needing to fix it or pray it away or pretend it wasn't happening. God, she thought, if you're there, I'm here, that's all I've got. The darkness didn't answer and didn't leave either. And for now, that strange coexistence of absence and presence, of being witnessed even in the deepest dark, was enough to keep her breathing until morning came. It started the next morning without planning or decision. Without Kate thinking, today I'm going to pray differently, it just happened. She woke at 5:15, later than the 4:52 ambush, but still early. Still dark, the house wrapped in that pre-dawn hush that felt like the world holding its breath. And she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, and instead of reaching for her Bible or journal or phone, she just sat, hands wrapped around the mug, steam rising, silence settling, no words forming in her mind, no requests or confessions or "Dear Heavenly Father, I come before you today," just presence, hers, and maybe, she wasn't sure, someone else's. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and the coffee cooled while she realized she was breathing differently, slower and deeper, like her lungs had remembered something her mind had forgotten. And the thought came clear and startling, this is prayer. Not because she was saying anything, but because she was being something present, open, willing to just exist in the same space as God without needing Him to perform or respond or fix her. A memory surfaced of Emma, at 3 years old, climbing into Kate's lap while she was reading. Not asking for anything or needing anything. Just curling up in the safety of proximity with her thumb in her mouth, content to simply be held. And Kate wondered if this was what God wanted. Not eloquence or theology or even faith, that felt like certainty. Just this showing up, this sitting down, this refusing to run. She stayed at that table for 20 minutes. And when she finally stood, nothing had changed, the grief was still there. The loneliness hadn't vanished. James's chair was still empty, but something in her chest felt less clenched, like a fist that had been gripping too hard for too long and was finally, tentatively, beginning to open. The experience stayed with her through the day. This sense of having stumbled onto something ancient and essential that her 40 years of religious practice had somehow overlooked. And she found herself looking forward to the next morning, not with dread, but with a curious anticipation, wondering if that quality of presence would return or if it had been a one-time grace. What she didn't know yet, sitting in her kitchen as afternoon light replaced morning, was that she'd just discovered the doorway to a completely different kind of faith, not the performance-based spirituality she'd been practicing all her life, but something quieter, deeper, more like breathing than striving. And this discovery would change everything about how she understood both God and herself in the months to come. Kate started reading again, but not the passages she'd underlined before or the verses she'd memorized in Sunday school or claimed as promises during hard seasons. She read the dark ones, the ones that didn't make it onto coffee mugs or inspirational in Instagram posts. She read David in the cave running from Saul, declaring, "I am forgotten like a dead man, out of mind. I have become like broken pottery," and Elisha under the broom tree, suicidal after his greatest victory, crying, "I have had enough. Lord, take my life." And Jesus in Gethsemane, face to the ground, sweating blood, pleading, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." These weren't triumphant saints powering through with praise, but people of God experiencing God's absence in their darkest hours. And the revelation that stopped Kate's breath was this: God didn't rebuke them for their honesty, didn't shame them for their despair, didn't demand they muster up more faith. met them there, in the cave, and under the tree, and in the garden, present in their suffering even when they couldn't sense his presence. She sat with that truth for days, turning it over, testing it against her own experience, and began to understand that the church had taught her to trust God's goodness even in suffering, which she did. She trusted his character and sovereignty and ultimate plan, but what the church hadn't taught her, or maybe she just hadn't been ready to hear it, was that God's nearness often looks like silence. Intimacy with him isn't always warm feelings and answered prayers, but sometimes just in presence, the choice to remain when every instinct screams to run. And she thought about the Israelites in the wilderness. 40 years of circling, 40 years of manna and complaints, and God's presence in a cloud they could see, but not touch. Proximity without clarity, companionship without comfort. That's where I am, Kate realized with something like relief. In the wilderness. And God hasn't left. He's just not performing the way I need him to. It was a strange comfort, naming her location on the spiritual map, because if this was the wilderness, then it wasn't the destination. It was the journey. And even the Israelites, with all their complaining and rebellion and perpetual dissatisfaction, eventually made it through. Not because they had perfect faith, but because God had perfect faithfulness. That night, she opened her journal and wrote, "I think you meet us in the dark, because that's when we stop pretending we can see. That's when we finally reach for your hand." And then after a pause, added with trembling honesty, "I'm reaching." It wasn't much of a prayer, wasn't eloquent or theologically sophisticated, but it was the truest thing she'd said to God in months. And she closed the journal feeling like she'd finally admitted where she actually was instead of where she thought she should be. And that admission felt like the first honest step toward wherever she was going. The shift was so subtle, Kate couldn't point to a specific moment when loneliness changed shape. Couldn't identify the exact day when she woke up and realized the quality of silence had changed. It was more like becoming aware that something fundamental had been transforming under the surface while she wasn't paying attention. She was still alone, the house still empty. James's absence still a physical ache that lived in her chest. But somewhere in the daily rhythm of waking at dawn and sitting at the kitchen table and breathing in the quiet, she'd stopped equating alone with abandon, had begun to understand that these were two entirely different conditions. Being alone was circumstantial, factual, a widow in a house built for two, while being abandoned was spiritual, existential, a soul untethered from its source. And she wasn't that even in the silence. Maybe especially in the silence, she was tethered, held, witnessed by something older and deeper and more permanent than any human relationship could be. She tested the thought one morning while washing dishes, speaking it out loud to the empty kitchen. "I'm alone, but I'm not lonely." And though it didn't feel completely true yet, it felt more true than it had a week ago. Felt like something she was growing into rather than something she was pretending. Kate had spent 40 years understanding God as Father, Savior, Lord roles in titles and theological categories, but now, in this raw, stripped-down season, she was learning him as companion. Not the God who fixed things, but the God who stayed. And she remembered something her spiritual director had said years ago during a crisis of doubt in her 30s. Sometimes God's greatest gift isn't an answer, it's his refusal to leave while you wait for one. She hadn't understood it then, had filed it away as one of those vaguely comforting spiritual platitudes people say when they don't know what else to offer. But she understood it now with the kind of clarity that only comes through experience. What she was discovering felt revolutionary and ancient at the same time. That presence could be more valuable than solutions. That being witnessed mattered more than being fixed. That God's companionship in the valley was a greater gift than immediate deliverance from it. This realization didn't make the grief disappear or restore her old life or give her back the husband she'd lost. But it did something else. It gave her a foundation to stand on when everything else felt like shifting sand. A sense that even when she couldn't feel God or sense his activity or understand his purposes, he was there in the room with her, keeping watch, bearing witness, holding her together when she couldn't hold herself. And that steady, unglamorous, undramatic faithfulness turned out to be exactly what she needed, even though it looked nothing like what she'd thought she wanted. Sunday morning arrived, and Kate dressed for church out of habit more than desire, pulling on slacks and a blouse and the silver cross necklace James had given her on their 20th anniversary. And she drove to Crossway Community early enough to park in her usual spot and walk through the double doors into the foyer, where coffee and donuts were laid out on folding tables and people clustered in familiar groups, laughing and catching up and living their normal, unbroken lives. Linda Morrison appeared with outstretched arms and overwhelming perfume, asking Kate, "Oh, honey, how are you?" And Kate gave the expected response, "I'm okay, thank you," while Linda continued, "You look good. You really do. I was just telling Bob. I said Kate is so strong. I don't know how she does it." And Kate smiled and nodded and let herself be hugged while thinking, "You have no idea. You have absolutely no idea." She made it to her pew, third row right side, the same spot she'd occupied for 17 years, and settled in while the worship band did sound check, drums and electric guitar, and that ascending keyboard line they used for every fast song. The lights dimmed and music swelled, and around her people stood with hands lifted and voices rising in unison, singing, "Blessed be your name, when the sun's shining down on me." And Kate felt at that profound dissonance between what was happening around her and what was happening inside her. Everyone was singing about God's goodness with smiles on their faces, confident and certain, while she stood in the middle of them feeling like she was on the other side of glass, watching but separate, unable to cross back into that world of easy faith and uncomplicated praise. When the song shifted to the bridge, louder and more passionate, "You give and take away, my heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name," she found she couldn't sing it. Not because she didn't believe it theologically, but because the gap between belief and feeling was too wide, and singing those words would feel like lying, not to God, but to herself. She sat down while people around her kept standing and singing, lost in worship, and felt more isolated in that crowd of believers than she did in her empty house. After the service, she slipped out during the closing prayer, drove home in silence, changed into sweatpants, and stood in her kitchen staring at nothing while understanding with sudden clarity that she needed something quieter, that whatever her faith was becoming couldn't survive in loud rooms with bright lights and expectations of joy she didn't feel yet. That night, she Googled contemplative prayer and clicked on articles about silence and presence and waiting. Read about the Desert Fathers and Brother Lawrence and people throughout history who'd found God not in noise but in the absence of it, and something in her chest whispered, yes, this, exactly this. What she was learning, what those early morning sessions at her kitchen table were teaching her, was that faith didn't have to be loud or demonstrative or full of raised hands and emotional worship, that sometimes the deepest communion with God happened in the quietest spaces. And this discovery felt like permission to stop trying to force herself back into a spiritual expression that no longer fit the shape of her soul. The turning point came on a Tuesday when Kate had been sitting at her kitchen table for 3 weeks straight every morning. Same spot, same mug, same silence, not because she'd turned it into a discipline, but because it was the only place she felt honest. The only hour of the day when she didn't have to perform or pretend or manage other people's expectations. This particular Tuesday, she sat longer than usual, and the coffee went cold and the sun shifted from the east window to the south. And an hour passed, maybe more, and somewhere in that extended sitting, a thought crystallized with the force of revelation. I've been trying to survive God. It hit her like recognition, like suddenly seeing a pattern that had been there all along but invisible until this moment. And she understood that for weeks, maybe months, if she was completely honest, she'd been white-knuckling her way through faith, gritting her teeth through worship songs, forcing herself to pray, clinging to belief like a life raft in a storm, and terrified that if she let go, she'd drown. Survival mode was what she'd been, in endurance, faith, the kind that says, God, I believe, help my unbelief. Just get me through this. Just don't let me fall away. But that wasn't relationship. That was self-preservation, dressed in religious language. And Kate stared at her cold coffee, understanding the distinction for the first time. She thought about James in their 36 years of marriage, thought about the hard seasons they'd weathered together, his father's death, her miscarriage, the year he lost his job and they burned through saving sand, realized that never once during those scary, uncertain times had she thought, I need to survive James. She'd thought, we'll get through this together, had leaned into the relationship rather than white-knuckling her way through it. So why was God different? Why was faith something to endure instead of something to rest in? The question hung in the air of her kitchen like an invitation. And Kate closed her eyes and for the first time in 2 months didn't pray at God, didn't perform faith or recite theology or try to muster up feelings she didn't have. She just leaned. It was a metaphorical leaning, a spiritual posture, like a child climbing into a parent's lap after a nightmare, not asking for anything but just needing proximity. And she thought simply, I'm tired. I'm so tired of trying to be strong enough for this. No audible response came, but in the silence something softened. Something that felt like permission to stop grinding, permission to stop performing, permission to just be with God the same way she used to just be with James. No agenda or pressure or need to prove anything, just companionship. When Kate opened her eyes, the kitchen looked the same, and the grief was still there, and the loss hadn't diminished. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what she was doing in these morning sessions. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was sitting, and in that sitting, that simple, exhausted, no more trying to impress God sitting, she felt closer to him than she had in years. Not because he'd suddenly shown up, but because she'd finally stopped running and allowed herself to be found. At 5 a.m., Kate woke without an alarm, her body having synchronized itself to some internal clock that measured time in relationship to dawn rather than duty. And she padded to the kitchen in her robe, started the coffee, settled into her chair, and looked up. The window above the sink that faced east toward the harbor was glowing, not with sunlight yet, but with that particular quality of pre-dawn luminescence when darkness begins its slow surrender to day, and she found herself arrested by a question. How long had this been happening? How many mornings had she sat here with eyes closed or fixed on her Bible or staring into her coffee, completely unaware that light was breaking outside her window? She stood and walked to the sink and pressed her palms against the cool counter and watched the sky layering itself deep purple at the top, bleeding into navy, then indigo, then that thin strip of pale gold at the horizon where the sun was gathering strength for its appearance. And the beauty of it caught her breath in her throat. It was breathtaking, and she'd been missing it during those first terrible weeks after James died, when she moved through the house like a ghost, seeing nothing and feeling nothing, just existing in a gray fog of survival. But the light had been here the whole time, breaking and returning and faithful. While she was drowning, dawn kept coming, kept performing its ancient ritual of transformation, regardless of whether anyone was watching. And Kate made a decision. She pulled a chair from the table, positioned it directly in front of the window, and sat with coffee in hand and Bible on her lap unopened. Just her and the slow miracle of morning. 20 minutes later, the sun crested the horizon, and gold spilled across the water, across the neighbor's roof, across her kitchen floor and a widening pool that reached her bare feet like an invitation. And Kate felt her throat tighten, not with grief this time, but with something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet. You've been here the whole time, she thought. I just couldn't see it. And she wasn't sure if she was talking to the sun or to God, or if maybe they were both manifestations of the same faithful presence that had been keeping her alive through these impossible months. What she was beginning to understand, sitting in that pool of morning light, was that healing wasn't always dramatic or obvious, wasn't always the kind of thing you could point to and say that's when it happened. Sometimes it was as quiet and inevitable as sunrise, happening whether you noticed it or not, changing you cell by cell, until one morning you looked up and realized you could see beauty again, could feel wonder again, could experience something other than the crushing weight of loss. And this ability to notice the light, to be stopped in her tracks by the daily miracle of dawn, felt like the first real evidence that she was coming back to life. The phrase came to her during the third week of her morning vigils when Kate was reading through the Psalms. Not systematically, but just letting the book fall open where it wanted. And Psalm 23 appeared, the old standby, the funeral favorite that she'd read 1,000 times and prayed over hospital beds and gravesides and her own anxious nights. But this morning, one word caught her attention in verse 3. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. And she found herself fixating on restore, remembering from a Bible study years ago that the Hebrew word was shubb, meaning to return to turn back, to bring back to a former state. But there was another layer, another meaning buried in the root that meant to flow back, like water returning to its source, or breath returning to lungs, or a soul learning to move again after being frozen in place by trauma. She set the Bible down and thought about the past 2 months, how she'd been trying so hard to fix her grief, to manage it, to push through it with discipline and prayer and sheer force of will, how she'd been grinding against it instead of learning to move with it. What if healing wasn't about forcing herself back to normal, but about learning to flow with God's rhythm instead of against it? She wondered, and she remembered James teaching Emma to swim when she was 5. How Emma had been terrified of the water and thrashed and panicked every time her feet left the pool bottom, until James held her and spoke quietly. "Don't fight it, sweetheart. The water wants to hold you. Let it." When Emma finally stopped struggling, when she relaxed into his arms and into the buoyancy of the water itself, she'd floated, and Kate thought soul flowing, not soul forcing, not soul just letting herself be carried by something stronger than her own effort. She wasn't sure if this was theology or metaphor or desperation talking, but it felt true, felt more true than anything she'd felt in months. This image of herself learning to relax into God's current instead of fighting upstream against it, trusting that the same love that brought the sun up every morning would carry her where she needed to go. That morning, she didn't pray a list of requests, or confess sins, or claim promises, or ask for strength. She just sat in the light, breathing, and let herself be held by the same love that had been holding her since before James died, since before she was born, since before time itself. For the first time since the funeral, her soul didn't feel like it was drowning, but like it was learning to float. And the difference between those two states felt monumental, even though externally nothing had changed. She was still a widow, still living alone, still missing her husband with an ache that would probably never completely disappear. But something internal had shifted, some fundamental orientation toward her circumstances. And she understood that this was what the psalmist meant by restoration. Not being returned to her former state, but learning to flow back toward her source. Letting the current of God's presence carry her through the grief instead of trying to swim against it. And in that flowing, she was discovering a kind of peace she'd never known in all her years of grinding spiritual effort. The revelation came quietly on a Tuesday afternoon in November when Kate was sitting at her kitchen table looking at a sympathy card she'd received 3 months earlier. One of dozens that had arrived in those first terrible weeks. And this one said in elegant script, "God will give you strength for this journey." There were well-meaning words, true words even. But as she stared at them, Kate realized with startling clarity, that wasn't what had actually happened. That wasn't her experience at all. God hadn't given her strength. She'd been weak every single day, broken every morning, barely functional most afternoons, had experienced no supernatural surge of power or divine ability to handle it or stay strong or any of the other things people kept telling her she was doing. So, if God hadn't strengthened her, what had he actually done? And she sat with that question, turning it over carefully, until the answer emerged slowly from somewhere deep in her understanding. He'd kept her not fixed, not healed, not even strengthened. Just kept like a shepherd keeping watch over a wounded sheep that can't walk. Not healing its leg or making it strong enough to run, but just sitting beside it in the dark, keeping the wolves away, keeping it breathing, keeping it alive one night at a time. Presence over power, companionship over cure. And Kate thought about those 4:52 a.m. mornings when grief woke her and she thought she couldn't survive another day. Thought about how she'd been right, she couldn't survive on her own strength. But somehow she had survived, had made it from that dark bedroom to this November afternoon, from drowning to floating, from survival mode to whatever this was. Not healing, exactly, not yet, but being held while healing happened at its own pace. And she realized this was the greater miracle she'd been too blind to see. Not the fixing, but the keeping. Not the dramatic intervention, but the steady, unglamorous faithfulness that showed up every morning whether she felt it or not. She opened her journal and wrote, "I kept asking you to fix me, to take away the grief, to make me strong. But you weren't fixing me. You were keeping me tethered when I wanted to drift, keeping me breathing when I wanted to stop, keeping me alive when alive felt like too much to ask. And maybe that's the greater miracle. not the fixing but the keeping. She stared at those words for a long time, feeling the truth of them settle into her bones, then added one more line that felt like both confession and gratitude. Thank you for not giving me what I asked for. Thank you for giving me what I needed. And in that moment of radical acceptance, of finally releasing her demands that God show up in particular ways and perform particular miracles, Kate felt something shift, not the circumstances, which remained unchanged, but her understanding of what God had been doing all along, quietly and faithfully keeping her alive through the darkest valley, not by making the valley disappear, but by refusing to let her walk through it alone. It happened on a Thursday in late November when Kate woke at her usual time, 5 a.m., give or take, padded to the kitchen and started the coffee and settled into her chair by the window, and realized with a start that her chest didn't hurt, not the physical ache she'd carried since September. That constant pressure behind her sternum, like grief, had taken up residence in her ribcage and refused to leave. But now it was lighter, and she took a breath, deep and testing, and found no tears threatening, no crushing wave of loss, just morning and coffee and light beginning to break over the harbor. She sat very still, almost afraid to move, afraid that acknowledging this change would make it disappear, like those moments in dreams when you realize you're dreaming and the realization itself pulls you awake. But it held this wasn't denial or numbness. She still missed James, still felt his absence in every empty chair in silent hallway, but the missing had changed shape. It wasn't drowning her anymore. It was just there, part of the landscape, part of her new normal. And she thought about what her grief counselor had said in their last session. Healing doesn't mean you stop missing them. It means you learn to hold the missing without it holding you. Was this it? This strange, fragile morning when she could think about James? Could remember his laugh and picture his face without being crushed by the remembering? When memory had become something she could carry rather than something that carried her under? She picked up her Bible and it opened randomly to Lamentations 3, and her eyes fell on the verse. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every morning, and she sat with those words, new every morning, understanding for the first time that they weren't recycled or rationed out in measured doses or withheld until she was strong enough or faithful enough to receive them, but given freely, whether she felt them or not. She'd survived on those mercies without even knowing it. All those mornings when she woke up, broken, and somehow made it to nightfall. All those 4:52 a.m. vigils when she sat in the dark and didn't disappear. And this morning, this quiet, tear-free, lighter chest morning was mercy too. Not because she'd earned it, but because that's what mercy did. It showed up every morning, new and faithful and relentless in its commitment to keeping her alive. Kate closed the Bible and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Thank you." And her voice didn't crack and she didn't cry. She just sat in the light held by a love that had never stopped holding her and let herself be. Grateful for something as small and monumental as a morning without tears. Understanding that this was what resurrection looked like, not a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 times resurrections. Morning after morning, breath after breath, mercy after mercy, until one day you woke up and realized you were living again. The text came from her daughter Emma on a Saturday evening. "Mom, are you lonely?" And Kate stared at her phone, considering the question carefully, because a month ago, the answer would have been immediate and just desperately lonely, but now she looked around her living room at the empty couch and silent television, at the absence of footsteps and voices, at all the external circumstances of loneliness still present and unchanged. She typed back, "I miss your dad, but I'm not lonely the way I was," and watched 3 dots appear and disappear and appear again before Emma responded, "What changed?" And Kate sat with that question, trying to articulate something she barely understood herself. What had changed wasn't her circumstances. She was still a widow, still lived alone, still woke up to empty spaces and silent mornings, but somewhere in those 3 months of sitting with God, not praying eloquent prayers or reading systematic theology, but just sitting, loneliness had changed its voice, had transformed from a scream into a whisper. It used to scream, "You are alone and abandoned and no one sees you and this will never end." But now it whispered, "You are alone, but you are witnessed. You are seen, you are held," and the difference was everything. Kate had spent 40 years believing that God's presence was something she had to feel to make it real. That if she didn't sense him or experience warmth or peace or joy, then something must be wrong with her faith. But these past 3 months had taught her different. The God's presence wasn't dependent on her feelings. It was a fact, a reality, a constant whether she felt it or not. She'd never been alone. She'd just been learning a new language of intimacy, one that didn't require performance or feelings or even certainty. Just trust, the quiet, unglamorous trust of showing up every morning to sit with someone she couldn't see, believing he was there anyway. She texted Emma back, "I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Your dad's absence is still real, but God's presence is more real. Does that make sense?" And the response came quickly. "It does. Mom, I'm so glad." Followed a moment later, "By you. Sound different, lighter." Kate smiled at her phone because lighter was exactly the word. Exactly what this whole journey had been about, not the removal of weight, but the redistribution of it. Learning to let God carry what she couldn't. Learning to flow with his current instead of fighting against it. Learning that loneliness and companionship could coexist in the same moment depending on which voice you chose to listen to. And she was choosing consciously now, rather than unconsciously, to listen to the whisper that said you are held, instead of the scream that said you are abandoned. And in that choice, she was discovering a kind of peace that had nothing to do with circumstances, and everything to do with whose presence she was paying attention to. Kate started keeping a list, not of prayer requests or sermon notes, but of the verses that had kept her breathing when breathing felt impossible. And she taped it to the inside of her kitchen cabinet above the coffee maker. So every morning when she reached for her mug, she saw them reminders, anchors, the words that had carried her when her own words ran out. Psalm 34-18 was first. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit," which she'd read in week 2 when crushed felt like the most accurate word in the English language for what was happening inside her chest. And God didn't promise to remove the crushing, just to be close during it, and that had mattered. Isaiah 41-10 came during a panic attack at 2 a.m., when the walls felt like they were closing in and she couldn't catch her breath. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. Not I will fix this or I will take away the fear, but simply I am with you." Presence as promise, and somehow that had been enough to get her through the night. John 14:27 spoke to her in a different way. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives." And she'd underlined it multiple times because the world's peace required circumstances to change, required problems to be solved, required grief to end. But God's peace existed alongside the grief, underneath it, holding it without being destroyed by it. Romans 8:38-39 became her anchor when death felt like separation. Neither death nor life, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. And she'd underlined death 3 times in her Bible because James's death had felt like separation from him and from her old life and from her sense of self, but not from God. Death had taken her husband, but it couldn't take her Savior. She'd spent decades treating Scripture like a textbook, something to study and memorize and apply, and that was good and had value. But these verses had become something else entirely. They'd become companions, friends who showed up in the dark and sat with her, who didn't need her to be eloquent or faithful or strong, but just spoke truth into the void and let the truth do its work. One morning in early December, Kate added one more verse to her list. Psalm 35. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." And she realized she'd always read it as a promise of quick resolution. Cry at night and wake up happy. But now she understood it differently. Night could last months, seasons, years even. But morning still came. Not because she'd prayed hard enough or believed strong enough, but because that's what mornings did. They came. Faithful and relentless and new, and joy, real, earned, battle-tested joy, came with them. Not the happiness of circumstances changing, but the deep, quiet gladness of surviving the night and discovering you're still held, still breathing, still capable of witnessing beauty and experiencing wonder, and choosing to trust the light even when darkness feels permanent. And these verses had taught her that, had held her hand through the darkest valley and brought her step by painful step toward a morning she'd once thought would never come. It happened so gradually, Kate almost didn't notice Jesus stopped being a concept and became someone, actual and present and near. And she couldn't explain to anyone who asked how to describe the shift from believing about someone to knowing them, from intellectual assent to experiential reality. For 40 years, he'd been Lord, Savior, Redeemer, titles she believed and doctrines she affirmed and theology she could articulate with precision. But somewhere between September's drowning and December's dawn watching, he'd become a person she was in relationship with. And the difference was like reading about the ocean versus standing in it. She remembered a conversation with James years ago during one of their late-night talks that ranged from theology to politics to whether they should repaint the bedroom. When she'd ask, "Do you think Jesus is actually with us, like right now, or is it more metaphorical?" And James had thought about it and said, "I think he's as present as we allow him to be." And she'd found that answer frustrating at the time, too vague and dependent on subjective experience. But now she understood, because these past 3 months she'd allowed Christ into spaces she'd never let him into before. The 4:52 a.m. terror, the angry thoughts she'd been too ashamed to voice in prayer, the moments when she resented everyone whose spouse was still alive, the days when she couldn't feel anything and wondered if she'd ever feel anything again. She'd stopped performing and stopped pretending and stopped trying to be the kind of Christian she thought she was supposed to be. And in that raw, ungarnished honesty, in that showing up exactly as she was broken and doubting and barely holding on, she'd found him, not fixing her or lecturing her or disappointed in her lack of faith. Just there, sitting with her, keeping her, witnessing her the way James used to sit with her on hard days, not needing to solve anything but just making space for her to be real. Christ was doing that now, and Kate realized this was what she'd been longing for all along. Not a God who performed miracles on demand, but a God who stayed, who showed up morning after morning, even when she had nothing to offer him but silence and tears and the feeble willingness to keep breathing. One morning in mid-December, she was sitting in her usual spot when the thought came clear as a voice. "I've always been here. You just needed to get quiet enough to notice." And Kate pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, I know you have," feeling it for the first time, not just believing it, but experiencing it. The presence, the companionship, the love that had been holding her since before James died, waiting patiently for her to stop running and let herself be held. She sat in that awareness for a long time while coffee went cold and the sun climbed higher and the house remained silent around her. But she wasn't alone, had never been alone, had just been learning how to recognize the companion who'd been there all along. And this recognition felt like coming home to a place she'd never left, like discovering that the things she'd been searching for had been carrying her the whole time, and all she'd needed to do was stop thrashing long enough to feel the arms that held her. It started with Beth Murphy, when Kate answered her doorbell at 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in January to find a woman she'd known for 7 years from Bible study and church potlucks, standing on her porch, holding the travel mugs of coffee and looking sheepish. "I'm so sorry. I know it's early, but I saw your kitchen light on and I just..." "Kampa si komi in?" Beth asked. And Kate stepped aside, and they sat at the kitchen table, Kate in her usual chair, Beth across from her where James used to sit. And for a moment, neither spoke until Beth said quietly, "My husband left me 3 months ago, affair with someone from his office. And I've been waking up at 5 a.m. ever since, and I don't know what to do with myself." Kate looked at her, really looked, and saw the exhaustion and hollow eyes and brittle smile that barely held. And when Beth continued, "Everyone keeps telling me to be strong, to pray more, to trust God's plan, but I don't feel strong and I can't pray, and I'm so angry I don't even know if I believe in God's plan anymore." Kate reached across the table and took her hand and said simply, "Me too. I mean, different circumstances, but the same hollowness." They sat like that for 20 minutes, not talking, just holding hands across a kitchen table while the sun rose outside and the coffee cooled in their mugs. And finally, Beth asked, "Can I come back tomorrow?" And Kate said yes. The next morning, Beth showed up at 5:30, and they sat and watched the light and said maybe 10 words between them. And the morning after that, Beth brought her Bible but didn't open it. Just set it on the table like a quiet declaration of, "I'm still here. I'm still trying." And a week later, Kate answered the door to find not just Beth, but Carol, a widow from the church's grief support group, who said uncertainly, Beth told me about your mornings. I hope it's okay. I just can't do the support group anymore. All that talking and processing, I need something quieter. By March, there were 7 of them rotating through. Some came every day, some once a week. Some just when the loneliness got too loud and someone jokingly called them the 5 a.m. sisters and the name stuck. They didn't have a format or curriculum or agenda. They just showed up and sat together and watched the light break and read a psalm if someone felt moved to, and prayed if words came, and sat in silence if they didn't. And something happened in that gathering that Kate couldn't have orchestrated or planned. These women, each carrying their own grief and shattering, and questions about whether God was real or present or good, became companions on the journey, not fixers or counselors, or even friends, exactly, but fellow travelers learning together how to flow instead of grind, how to sit with God instead of survive Him, how to let the morning light be enough of a miracle for one day. One morning in April, Beth looked around the table and said with her voice thick, "I didn't think I'd make it this far." And Carol nodded. "Me neither." And Kate said softly, "But we did. We're still here." And there were 7 women with 7 different stories of loss gathered around one table, held by one light, kept by one faithful God who showed up every morning whether they felt Him or not. And in that showing up together, they were discovering that resurrection was communal, that healing happened best in witness, that sometimes the greatest gift you could give another suffering soul was not answers or solutions, but simply the willingness to sit together in the dark and wait for morning to come. The phone call came on a Sunday afternoon in May from a woman at church Kate barely knew, asking if they could meet for coffee, saying, "I heard about your mornings with the other women, and my mom died 6 weeks ago, and I don't know how to keep going." Her name was Jessica, 34, and too young to be navigating this kind of loss. And they met at the cafe downtown, where Jessica ordered tea she didn't drink and sat with her hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Everyone keeps saying it gets easier," Jessica said. Does it get easier?" And Kate thought about that question, about how the easy answer people wanted to hear was yes, but the true answer was more complicated. And she said carefully, "It doesn't get easier, but it gets different. The grief doesn't shrink. You just grow around it. You learn to hold it without letting it hold you." Jessica's eyes filled and she said, "I don't know how to do that." And Kate responded, "Neither did I. I'm still learning, but you seem so together." Jessica said, "People talk about you like you're this example of faith, like you figured it out." And Kate almost laughed, not from cruelty, but from the absurdity of perception versus reality. And she said, "Jessica, 4 months ago, I was sitting in my kitchen at 4:52 in the morning, honestly wondering if I could survive another day. I couldn't pray, couldn't feel God, could barely function on, not an example of having it together. I'm an example of what happens when you stop trying to have it together and just show up, even when showing up is all you can manage." They talked for 2 hours, and Kate didn't offer solutions or quote verses or share 5 steps to healing. She just told the truth about the 4:52 a.m. wake-ups in church feeling too loud, and the day she realized God wasn't fixing her, just keeping her, and learning to sit instead of survive. And Jessica listened like someone hearing a language she'd forgotten she knew. "Can I come to your mornings?" Jessica asked as they were leaving. And Kate said, "Of course." And Jessica showed up the next day at 5:30 and sat at the table with the other women and cried through the entire hour while nobody tried to stop her. They just sat with her and handed her tissues and let her grief take up all the space it needed. At 6:45, Jessica stood to leave and paused at the door, saying, "Thank you for not trying to fix me." And after she left, Beth looked at Kate and said, "You know what you are? A witness. You're witnessing to these women that it's possible to survive, not by being strong, but just by being held." Kate sat with that word witness, having always thought witnessing meant evangelizing and sharing the gospel and leading people to salvation. But maybe it meant something simpler. Maybe it just meant standing in front of other people who were drowning and saying, "I was there too. I know that water, and look, I'm still breathing." Not because she'd figured everything out, but because she'd learned to stop fighting the current and let love carry her. And if her survival could be a map for someone else's journey, not a promise that it would be easy, but proof that it was possible, then maybe that was witnessing after all. By June, Kate had been a widow for 9 months. 9 months of mornings, 9 months of slowly learning a new language of faith, 9 months of discovering that healing wasn't linear or loud or anything like she'd expected, and people at church kept commenting on how well she was doing. "You're glowing," Linda Morrison said after service one Sunday. And Pastor Mike squeezed her shoulder, saying, "Sasha testimony," and another woman whispered with eyes shining in admiration, "I don't know how you do it." And Kate smiled and thanked them and moved on. But later, sitting in her car in the church parking lot, she wondered what exactly they thought they were seeing. Because from the inside, it didn't feel like victory or triumph or overcoming or any of the words people associated with successful faith. It felt like continuance, like the simple, unglamorous act of continuing to breathe and show up and put one foot in front of the other, even when she still missed James, still woke up sometimes forgetting he was gone, still had moments and whole days even when the grief grabbed her by the throat and refused to let go. But this was the crucial difference. She also laughed now. Genuine laughter, not the polite kind she'd forced in October. And she looked forward to mornings instead of dreading them. And felt God, not in fireworks or dramatic interventions, but in the quiet, steady way the sun showed up every day, whether she noticed it or not. Gentle renewal. That's what this was. Not a phoenix rising from ashes in some dramatic transformation, but more like a garden after winter, still scarred and still bearing marks of the frost, but with green things pushing through the soil anyway. Tentative and fragile and alive. Kate thought about the women at her table, each of them in different stages of their own winters, some still frozen solid. Saw me thawing. Some like her discovering the first green shoots and not quite believing they were real, and she understood that none of them were healed. But all of them were healing, and there was a profound difference between those two states. Healing as a destination meant you had to arrive. Shad Dafini had to be done with grief and move on. But healing as a process meant you could honor where you'd been and inhabit where you were and trust, where you were going all at the same time. And that's what the 5 a.m. sisters were learning together. One morning, Beth said something that landed like truth in Kate's chest. "I used to think renewal meant going back to who I was before, but I'm never going to be that person again. And I think that's okay." And Kate nodded, understanding completely, saying, "I'm not the same woman I was when James was alive. I can't be." And when Carol asked, "So what is renewal then?" Kate looked around the table at 7 women with 7 different losses and 7 different versions of resurrection and said, slowly, "Maybe it's not about going back. Maybe it's about learning to flow forward, taking what was and honoring it and letting it become part of what's next." Jessica whispered, soul flowing. And Kate said, "Yes, exactly that. Not forcing, not grinding. Not white-knuckling your way back to normal, but opening your hands and trusting the current and letting God carry you toward a future you can't see yet, but don't have to fear." And that was renewal. Gentle and gradual and real and more beautiful than she'd ever imagined. If you're watching this, it's probably 3 a.m. or 4:52, or some other godforsaken hour when grief wakes you and refuses to let you go back to sleep. And you're alone in a bed that used to hold 2, in a house that used to have sounds, in a life that used to make sense, and you're wondering if you'll ever feel normal again. I need to tell you something you won't. Not the old normal. That's gone, and I'm so sorry because I know how much that hurts, but here's what else I need you to know. There's a new normal coming, and it's not what you think. It's not moving on like people keep telling you to do, or staying strong, or trusting God's plant, or any of the other phrases that feel like sandpaper on an open wound. It's learning to hold the loss without being crushed by it. It's discovering that God's presence doesn't feel like you thought it would, and that's okay. It's sitting in the dark at 4:52 in the morning, and slowly, painfully, gradually realizing you're not sitting alone. And I don't know your name, but if you lost a husband or wife or parent or child, or whether it was sudden or slow, expected or shocking, but I know the shape of the hole they left, and I know what it's like to wonder if you'll ever stop drowning. Here's what I learned you. Don't stop drowning by fighting the water. You stop drowning by learning to float, by letting yourself be held by something bigger than your grief and stronger than your fear and more faithful than your feelings. I'm not going to tell you it gets easier, because some days it does and some days it doesn't, but I will tell you this: it gets different. The sharp edges soften and the constant ache becomes occasional, and the mornings start to feel less like survival and more like just mornings. And one day, I promise you this, one day you'll wake up and your first thought won't be about what you lost but about coffee, or the sunrise, or something small and ordinary and beautiful. You'll feel guilty for it. At first, like you're betraying their memory by daring to experience a moment of peace. But you're not. You're just learning to live again. Not the same life, but a different one. A life that honors what was while making space for what's coming. And you're not alone in this, even when you feel alone. Especially when you feel alone. Because God is there in the dark and in the silence and in the 4:52 a.m. Vigils when you can't pray and can't cry and can't do anything but breathe. And if you can find even one other person who understands, one friend, one support group, one table of women who wake up too early and sit together watching the light return, hold on to them. Let them witness your grief. Let them sit with you in it. Let them remind you on the days you forget that morning still comes. You're going to make it through this not because you're strong, but because you're held. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're learning to sit with the questions. Not because the pain will disappear, but because you'll grow large enough to carry it without letting it carry you under. And I know this because I was where you are. I was drowning in that same dark water. And somehow, not through my own strength, but through a love that refused to let me go, I made it to the other side of impossible. And if I can do it, if these women around my table can do it, then so can you. One breath at a time, one morning at a time, one moment of surrender at a time, until the day you look up and realize you're not just surviving anymore. You're living, and the light that seems so far away has been there all along, faithful and patient and waiting for you to finally see it. Kate stood at her kitchen window in a morning in late June, watching the sun crest the horizon for what felt like the 1,000th time. 9 months since James died, 9 months of drowning and floating and slowly learning to breathe again. On the table behind her held 6 coffee mugs, because the 5 a.m. sisters would be arriving soon. Beth and Carol and Jessica and the others, each carrying their own grief, each learning their own version of flowing instead of grinding. She thought about that first terrible morning after the funeral when the house felt erased and God felt absent, and she honestly didn't know if she could survive. Thought about how if someone had told her then that 9 months later she'd be hosting a group of grieving women in her kitchen, that she'd be waking up, grateful for mornings, that she'd feel God's presence as something constant and real. She wouldn't have believed them because it had seemed impossible. But here she was, still wounded and still healing and still missing James, with an ache that would probably never fully disappear, but also alive and present and witnessed, held by a love that had carried her through the darkest valley and was still carrying her, one sunrise at a time, towards something new. The doorbell rang and Kate opened it to find not just her regular group, but 2 new faces. Women she'd never seen before, who'd been referred by Jessica, desperate for a place where grief was allowed and faith didn't have to feel like performance. And she said, "Come in, there's always room at this table." They gathered 7 women, then 9, then 11 chairs pulled up around a kitchen table built for Kate poured coffee and passed around mugs and looked at each face, some tear-streaked and some exhausted and some just beginning to show the first fragile signs of hope. And she said quietly, "Welcome to Soul Flowing. Not a program or method or formula for grief recovery, but just a way of being. A way of showing up broken and letting God hold you while you heal. A way of stopping the grind and learning the flow. A way of trusting that the same love that brings the sunrise every morning, faith and relentless and new would keep bringing you back to life too. One dawn at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of surrender at a time." Outside the window, light spilled across the water, and inside the kitchen, 11 women sat in silence. And in that silence, in that sacred space between grief and hope, between loss and renewal, between drowning and floating, they found what they'd been looking for all along, not answers or certainty or even healing yet, but presence and companionship and the gentle, persistent, unstoppable flow of a love that never stops carrying its children home. "This is soul flowing," Kate whispered, and the morning light answered back with its daily resurrection, with its faithful return, with its quiet insistence that darkness never gets the final word. And she understood now what she couldn't have understood 9 months ago when she was drowning in that empty kitchen. That this was always how it worked, that God had always been a God of mornings, a God who met his people in the dark and then refused to leave them there, a God whose mercy showed up, new every single day, whether you noticed it or not, whether you felt it or not, whether you believed it or not, until finally one morning you woke up and realized you weren't just surviving the dark anymore. You were learning to trust the light that had been holding you all along. Catherine didn't get her old life back. She got something different, something she never would have chosen but learned to receive, a life where grief and joy coexist, where mornings are sacred again, not because the pain is gone but because presence is more real than pain, where faith isn't about feeling but about showing up even when showing up is all you can manage. The 5 a.m. sisters still gather at her table, and some mornings there are 3 women, and some mornings there are 12. And they don't have a curriculum or follow a program. They just show up and watch the light and learn to flow. And slowly, gently, impossibly, they're finding that renewal doesn't mean going back, but means learning to move forward in rhythm with a love that never stopped holding them, even in the dark, especially in the dark. What Catherine discovered in those 9 months from September's drowning to June's gentle resurrection was that God had always been a God of mornings, a God who met his people in their darkest hours, not to immediately fix them, but to keep them, to sit with them, to witness their suffering, and refuse to leave until light returned. And this keeping, this patient, faithful presence turned out to be the greater miracle she'd been too desperate to see. 9 months after James died, Catherine stood at her kitchen window watching 11 women gather around a table built for 4. And she understood that her survival had never been about her own strength, but about learning to stop fighting the current, about discovering that the same love which orchestrated sunrise every single morning without failure was also orchestrating her resurrection, cell by cell, breath by breath, mercy by mercy, until healing happened not as a destination, but as a process of growing large enough to hold loss without being crushed by it. She thought about Jessica, 34, and drowning in fresh grief, sitting at that table crying while the other women simply witnessed her pain without trying to fix it. And she understood that this was what witnessing meant, not having all the answers, but being willing to say, I was there too. I know that water, and look, I'm still breathing. The table was bigger than any of them had imagined, the community of wounded healers growing week by week. And what they were learning together was that you don't have to flow alone. That companionship transforms loneliness, not by removing it, but by reminding you that you're seen, that you're held, that you're witnessed by both the God who never leaves and the sisters who choose to stay. If you're watching this at 3 a.m. or 4:52 or some other impossible hour when grief has you by the throat, know this: you're not alone. The table is bigger than you think. And the morning always comes not because you're strong enough to make it come, but because that's what mornings do. They come, faithful and relentless and new, carrying mercy you didn't earn and grace you can't exhaust, in a love that refuses to let darkness have the final word. Catherine Walsh learned to flow after 40 years of grinding, learned to sit after decades of surviving, learned to trust the light after months of drowning in dark. And if she can make that journey from widow to witness, from broken to held, from barely breathing to fully alive, then so can you, one morning at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of surrender at a time, until the day you wake up and realize that the God you thought had abandoned you had been keeping you all along, had been waiting patiently for you to get quiet enough to notice his presence, had been flowing you home through waters you thought would drown you. And all you ever needed to do was stop fighting and let yourself be carried.